Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Roz Modorsky, a senior at Cleveland Heights High School and a member of the Youth Forum Council. I'm so happy to welcome you to today's Youth Forum, a conversation on affirmative action and unintended consequences. As fall arrives, high school seniors like myself begin to think about our futures, which often includes applying to college. When determining acceptance, in addition to the SAT, ACT, your GPA, extracurricular activities, personal statements, and recommendations, universities have begun to look at diversity as well. However, a growing number of states are banning the prioritization of race in admissions, a process commonly known as affirmative action. In addition to state action, those targeted in the policy are also expressing contradictory opinions. White women are the most supported by affirmative action, but a majority of that group opposes the policy. Asian American voters mostly support the policy, but the Justice Department is currently investigating whether it fosters discrimination against the group. It can be argued that affirmative action has created more complexities in the college admissions process with disputable progress, as Black and Hispanic students are still underrepresented at top colleges that utilize affirmative action. The panelists here today will speak about the effects the policy has had on college admissions with regard to the minority and underrepresented groups it intends to uplift. Our first panelist is Mr. Mike Brickner, Senior Policy Director of the ACLU of Ohio, who has dedicated his career to mass incarceration issues, particularly the intersection between criminal justice and poverty and the treatment of people in prisons and jail. Dr. Maurice A. Stinnett is the Vice President of University Engagement and Chief Diversity Officer at Cleveland State University. Dr. Stinnett began this position in July and is committed to connecting Cleveland State students with the community and increasing diversity across campus. Dr. Jessica Kelley, a professor in the Department of Sociology at Case Western Reserve University, studies the causes and consequences of health disparities over the life course, particularly those related to race, socioeconomic status, and disability. She also works on issues of access to healthy food in disadvantaged urban areas. Here to guide our discussion today is Youth Forum Council President TiOlu Oresanya.
Thank you, Ross, for that introduction. We're glad to have all of you here for our first forum of the school year, and we hope to have you join us for the other 5. Today, however, we're here to talk about affirmative action. Please be aware that we do only have 30 minutes for this part of the panel. We'll try to get as in-depth as possible with our panelists, but you will get the opportunity to ask them any questions that you may have. Affirmative action has been defined many ways, sometimes called positive discrimination, a pathway to equal rights, a thumb on the scale, or fair education policy. Dr. Kelley, we'll start with you, and everyone will get the chance to answer this question. How would you define affirmative action as it currently stands and is being used today?
Well, affirmative action historically started, we think of it as sort of starting around the Johnson era president, and he was really sort of thinking at that time about affirmative action, taking forward steps to increase access and diversity. Unfortunately, through the 70s and the 80s, it got translated into a quota system, which then started to pit group against group and person against person, which unfortunately gave the affirmative action sort of a really sort of difficult space to operate in. In higher education, today, a lot of the controversy is around the idea of we want diverse student populations. So we want to use affirmative action to make diversity in those spaces. But again, the issue is you have to use race and ethnicity as a criterion if you're going to have that sort of forced diversity into the campus. So it still brings up this idea in the controversy around quota systems.
All right. Mr. Brickner, if you'd like to.
So for me, affirmative action recognizes the history of our country and that the United States is founded on racial oppression and sexism. There has been a lot of discussion in recent weeks, particularly in the aftermath of Charlottesville, about white supremacy. And many people point to white nationalists, KKK, Nazi members as emblematic of white supremacy, and they certainly are. But also, so are all of the social systems here in the United States and how the country actually works. That is the, I think, more prevalent and insidious forms of white supremacy that are out there. How our education system works, our healthcare system, our economic system, our criminal justice system, that they are all built to hold people of color back. And so the affirmative action system takes that into account. And it helps to equalize the playing field for people of color in particular. And so I see it as incredibly important and that pathway to equality.
All right, Dr. Stinnett.
Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. My definition would be very much so aligned with my colleagues just said, is the ongoing, important, somewhat complicated work to ensure equal access and opportunity for everyone. It's a very difficult process, but it is an important process. We know it's necessary because of the historical, institutionalized racism, discrimination, et cetera. So it's that ongoing, messy, tough work that we must do to level this playing field, that every student, every person has equal access and opportunity. And that's how I would define it. It's complicated, it's tough, but it's essential and necessary work that we must continue to do and move forward with.
All right, there are several criticisms of the affirmative action program. However, one of the main ones being a phenomenon known as mismatch. When a minority student is accepted into one of the elite colleges as an affirmative action student, and as a result, they drop out or don't graduate on time. How can that issue be resolved, or is that just a permanent, unfortunate side effect of affirmative action? Dr. Stinnett, if you'd like to.
I think that's interesting. I was doing some research on this, and Harvard and Princeton president actually did a study, two elite institutions, as you know. And they did a study about college admission access and affirmative action and talked about if they removed this process of affirmative action, what would the numbers look like for whites being admitted into the schools? It only moved from 25% to a 26% acceptance rate. Okay, so it was no marginal difference in that aspect. The reality is that there are students who come from all various backgrounds that do not matriculate and finish in college, all right? And there's multiplicity of factors that impact that. So it's not just the fact that underrepresented students getting access meant that forfeited an opportunity for a white student that would have made it through. That's assuming that all white students that have access to those colleges are going to finish as well. That's not true. And so I think that's the answer to that. It doesn't really make a significant difference. People want to pretend that it does, but it doesn't bear out with the data and the facts that have been presented.
So you're saying, if I could clarify, that affirmative action does not change the acceptance rate of white students or of the majority?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Again, 25% was the acceptance rate for white students in these elite schools. When they removed the affirmative action, according to their data from the presidents of Harvard and Princeton, it only moved up to 26%, 1% difference. So not anything significant at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to mention an instance in California in 1998. They forced California state universities to stop looking at race in their admission processes. As a result, they found that fewer minority students were being accepted, but also fewer minority students were dropping out, and the same amount of minority students were graduating from those schools. Dr. Kelley, I would like you to speak to this. Do you think that if affirmative action was removed, do you think it would allow, or it would help minorities to go to schools maybe closer to their academic level and help them to actually finish on time and get that college education?
Well, I'd actually like to take a quick caution here, which is sort of this implication that minority students or students of color have come from disadvantaged backgrounds and it's implicit in the assumption that these students are going to struggle more or that they are not academically prepared. So I actually don't care for the mismatch discussion because it has that implicit bias in it. And I also want to point out it's actually very difficult, and there's a lot of studies that have shown it's very difficult for college students of color in majority white universities because they're assumed to be there because of affirmative action. They're assumed to be some kind of token and label. And in fact, we've seen that actually affects their self-esteem, how much work they put in their courses and in their majors. And so it is a risk for dropping out because you don't feel like you belong, and people have let you know that. So in some sense, I think we should change the conversation around this and not sort of imply, as Dr. Stinnett said, that the all white students are prepared in some way that's disproportionate.
Do you think that if the affirmative action, what can be done to the conversation on affirmative action in employment and in college education to make sure that minorities aren't being looked upon as diversity hires or token or token minorities as students?
I'm really glad that you actually also brought in the issue of employment, because I think oftentimes we do talk about this in terms of just university admissions, but also, as the ACLU, we are an affirmative action employer, and as a hiring manager, it's something that I look at quite a bit in terms of how do we create a equitable, inclusive workforce. And I think also for our campuses, we need to look at that as well. I think that there are a lot of ways that you can do that. I think first of all, you have to make changes not just by adding people into the community, but you also have to make changes in the power structures within the organization. So do people of color have some sort of buy-in to the organization? Do they have real power? Are they spread out diversely throughout many different places in the organization? Or are they only being tokenized to a specific place within the organization? I think, again, giving voice and actual institutional power to those individuals will help to create a more inclusive and equitable workplace or campus environment.
Let me respond to that. I think that's important for me to say this. You asked what could we do to make sure that these perceptions are not, the onus is not on the people of color to do that, okay? It's not my job to convince you that I have value. It's not any person's of color or minority's job to convince the employer or the educational enterprise that they belong there. It's on the enterprise to recognize that, to study that. As the Chief Diversity Officer at Cleveland State, that's my job, to ensure the institution recognizes there's already value there, and to confront the implicit bias of the institution to say, why is it that we make these assumptions and assume this about these particular students? So it's not our responsibility to do anything except to be brilliant and to be who we are. It's the institution's job to look at that and reevaluate why they see them that way.
Exactly, and even in the scenario that you set up previously about if there were students at a Ivy League school who were not successful in their first year, the way that the question was set up may have focused more on what was going on with the student. I might say, well, what was going on with the institution, right? How does the institution need to change to ensure that those individuals may be successful?
Okay. Dr. Kelley, what reforms can be put in place in affirmative action, either by a university or by a government institution, to make it better and more effective in its purpose?
Well, I think one of the first things you have to think about is what's the point of affirmative action, right? And if you go back to sort of Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument about the case for reparations, right? The idea is that we're trying to make up for past injustices, and when you're trying to undo 100 years of a system, that has purposely discriminated and kept people of color out of opportunity structures, the idea is a simple college admission here or there isn't how you fix the problem. It's one part, right? But you need to start. You would need to start down at the elementaries, right? We need to start and say, are we equitably spending public monies across schools? Are we preparing students to be competitive at all levels? Are we, so the idea is that we really have to think about rebuilding a structure. And part of that is just more than, as I say, this admissions officer checks this box and not that box.
All right. Dr. Stinnett, what reforms do you think can be put in place?
I think she nailed it. I mean, we need to, the reform, first of all, is taking a strong look at the history of how it was developed and what we need to continue to do to work on that. I mean, I think, again, there's a lot of historical systemic things at play when it comes to, the reforms that need to take place. But most importantly, let me say this. I think what we need to do outside of, again, looking at the individuals or thinking about the groups, look at ourselves, look at the system and say, what is it that is producing and pushing us to continue to treat these people this way? Why are we doing that? Investigate, look at yourself. Self-exploration is the most important, critical part of this. And that's what I like to stay focused on.
All right, so it was reported in August that the Trump Justice Department may be reviewing affirmative action policies in colleges across America. Mr. Brickner, what do you think the Trump administration might do, and what can they do from the federal government level to actually make affirmative action more effective, or what do you think they should do?
Sure. Well, it's hard to know what the Trump administration might do because I'm not sure that the Trump administration knows what it might do as of yet. That seems to change on a minute-by-minute basis, depending with what's on Twitter. But there are certainly many things that the Department of Justice could do. they have in the past brought civil rights investigations or litigation to bear on particular affirmative action programs. And we've seen where, in this administration in particular, even though the Department of Justice has traditionally been a bastion of justice, that they have sometimes furthered policies that I would say are not in the interest of justice. And so they could certainly investigate and bring litigation to challenge some affirmative action policies, claiming that they may discriminate against another group of people. I think that would be fairly disastrous for us here in the United States. The legal landscape for affirmative action is still extremely tenuous. We had a good decision out of the Fisher, Texas case last year that helped to sustain affirmative action, but it has been very much on the ropes recently. And so if the Trump administration, through the Department of Justice, were to begin to investigate these programs and join up with some of the legal groups who have been pushing for legal challenges against affirmative action over the last few decades, it could be very negative for the future of affirmative actions on colleges and universities.
Dr. Kelley, I posed the same question to you. What could the Trump administration do?
Well, I think they could probably sort of work toward, right, if you're going to work toward your base, right, the idea is that whites, historically, don't like their power structures dismantled. So in some sense, we have to sort of fight, we have to fight against a system that feels very comfortable because it keeps rewarding whites in the system. So one of the things to keep in mind is one of the very first affirmative action policies was actually at Harvard in 1920 because there were too many Jewish students getting in on merit. And so they decided to put a quota on how many Jewish students could get in so that the whites could continue to keep going to Harvard. So if you think about the history of how we've thought about these, all that's going on now with this controversy about affirmative action is, again, that same discomfort with dismantling the structures of white privilege. So I would suspect that an administration that would want to play to that base would continue to chip away at these great gains that we've made and continue that rhetoric.
As I'm sure all of you up here know, affirmative action was put heavily into practice, started being put into practice in 1961 by President Kennedy. And I'm wondering, since we've had the program for close to 56 years, why have some of the reforms that you've talked about here haven't been put in place? And what can be done on a government level and what should be done by institutions? Dr. Stinnett, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, you gave me the tough one. Yeah, I know. I'm sitting here. It's been around for quite some time. And you're asking the question is, what can we do now to improve it or put in place to continue to further? Ask me the question, make sure I'm answering.
Why has so little been done, and what can be done going forward? Okay,
I think I want to say so little has been done because, again, it disrupts the power system, right? When you really engage in this affirmative action work, you have to remove yourself from the center of power and become more inclusive. And in doing that, that's challenging. I think a lot of this has been slow and stagnant because, again, we were first just checking boxes, filling quotas, but not being intentional about how to sustain this, how to improve it, how to grow it, right? And if you have anything as a knee-jerk reaction and you haven't thought through it, and you haven't committed to it, I think we have to commit to it as a country that this is what we really want, and this is how this needs to look. And in that commitment, there's going to be discomfort, there's going to be challenge, there's going to be loss, right? Change brings loss, and I think we have to be willing to accept those losses to bring about this inclusive environment that we're looking for.
All right. Yeah. So a major beneficiary, a slight change of topics, a major beneficiary of affirmative action are women. Before Title IX and affirmative action, men were going to college and graduating at significantly higher rates than women. But today, women across all socioeconomic classes and races are going to college, staying in college, and graduating at higher rates than men. Why do you think that affirmative action and maybe Title IX have been so effective in bringing women into these spaces across all races, but maybe not doing the same for minority people of color? Dr. Kelley?
Oh, go ahead,
Or
do you
Mr.
have a thought?
Brickner.
You can go ahead first. I'll follow.
Well, I think one thing we do know, right, and white women in particular have greatly benefited from this sort of inclusive, because we added gender. Gender wasn't originally part of the affirmative action, but it got added I believe in the late 60s. So, and so it became an easy win, right? It was an easy one. We weren't as threatened by women having power. So it became an easy way to say, look, we're more diverse, that we have more diversity. We got chicks running around, so this idea that you sort of, felt comfortable with it, and I think that's played into the idea that we still can't dismantle race in the same way.
I would agree with that, and I think it's connected with the previous question as well in terms of what we need to do better or more of. I think that we also have to look at how affirmative action interplays with other systems that perpetuate white supremacy. So I think a great example is the mass incarceration system in the United States, that we have had this explosion with the war on drugs since the 1970s, really after a lot of the civil rights laws and affirmative action came into play in the 60s. And so we have seen this mass incarceration of people of color. Here in the state of Ohio, Black people make up 12% of the population, but about 50% of the state's prison population. We see where whole communities have been totally eviscerated because they have people who have criminal convictions who can't get jobs. If they have a drug conviction, it makes it harder for them to get educational opportunities and funding for education. And so we see how the mass incarceration system has been deployed against communities of color, pushing them even further back. And so it's made affirmative action and the goals and ideals of it harder to realize for people of color, I think. And so we have to look at dismantling those systems as well if we hope for affirmative action to realize its full promise.
And I also think, and to add to that, I think the question was also about why is it that it seems like white women are, as a result of affirmative action, having more access to college. I think the systems and the supports well before they get to college are actually much more in place for white women than they are for people of color, okay? Think about the K through 12 system. That's a huge impact on whether or not you're going to be able to actually get access and obtain a college degree. And if you happen to be a white female in a different community that has more supports than an African-American person of color, then that by itself is going to dictate whether or not you have access. So I think those systems are actually better in place for white women outside of the sphere of actually accessing, before they even access higher ed. That's what I'm getting at.
I know all of you at least once have mentioned the K through 12 system and how that is such a big determination and how ready someone is for college. What can be done more there to make sure people of color are a little more prepared or have a level playing field?
Well, I think first of all, we as a state have been negligent in terms of changing how schools are funded here. That we have a Ohio Supreme Court that has ruled multiple times that the way that we fund public schools in the state of Ohio is unconstitutional, and we have not changed it. And it inherently leads to unequal outcomes where people who live in lower income communities have less resources for public education, and that leads to different results for them in life. And so we don't want people's opportunities to be decided just by the zip code where they were born. And unfortunately, the way that our public school systems are set up right now, that is the reality.
I think you just cannot underestimate the power of residential segregation in creating these systems of inequality. And I know I keep hammering on the past, but past is prologue, right? That when Black veterans were coming back from World War II, they were not given white, and they had home ownership opportunities and loans. They could only get loans in certain areas that were red-lined, right? And the banks didn't want to fund them. So we forced and created residential segregation, racial residential segregation, and then built on that a funding of public education that immediately disadvantaged those schools, and it just cumulatively moved forward.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I was going to talk about the red line, but since that's been brought up, let's talk about what we know works, and that's early childhood education, right? We already know that works. We already know that's actually severely underrepresented, if you will, or underdelivered rather, in minority communities, that is where you get the biggest return on your investment, all right? And as an educator and a K through 12 educator at first, I recognized that that was the most critical component that was lacking. We already know that young people from more affluent neighborhoods and communities, white schools, white neighborhoods, et cetera, have access more affluent to that early childhood education. If we're going to change the K through 12 sector, it starts there, getting the funding right, number one, and then investing in the early childhood education programs. That's the critical piece.
Okay, so as one final question, Mr. Brickner, you mentioned the Fisher versus Texas case. After that decision, 65% of Americans, Gallup showed that 65% of Americans disagreed with the Supreme Court decision. How can we drum up more support for affirmative action, or how can it become more, instead of an institution issue, more of a personal issue for people so that they're not placing the work on the institution and it's on themselves?
I think that that's a really important point because, and I think it goes back to something that Dr. Stinnett said earlier about particularly white communities taking on this work, that we have to understand and acknowledge and champion affirmative action and racial equity. And that I think that we as a public and we as advocates have maybe been too shy in that. I think that we have to make the case to the public as to why affirmative action is not just a responsibility, but it's actually something that we need to do, that we must do, and that it is something that will benefit us. And I think that it has been not talked about in that way, and that instead people see it as something that could potentially harm them in the future, and that there isn't really an understanding of how affirmative action works as well. And so when people don't understand how something works, they just default to no, that they don't want it.
Please.
Well, I think I want to be sort of careful in the sense that, changing hearts and minds one by one, that's optimistic, but in some ways we're trying to emphasize the idea that sometimes you have to change the structures and then bring people along. But we have, in many ways, I've been amazed in the last 5 years, 10 years, that how the conversations are really changing. There really is, and so when we force the cultural conversation to change, people become more aware. There's a new book out that's called Waking Up White, and it's this idea, and the author basically says, I didn't notice my whiteness, for most of my life, and all of a sudden I realized where I was in this particular social and historical and geographic place. So it's happening in those sorts of things, and that's what will bring along support for affirmative action. So I would say that it's not selling a program, it's about changing a cultural conversation.
Yeah, I think in stepping back and looking and asking ourselves, why was affirmative action created, okay? And in doing so, it was created because of a flawed system, a flawed way of interacting and engaging with humanity, all right? We were discriminating against individuals. And so when we reflect on that and think that this was created because of a wrong way of thinking, a wrong way of engaging and doing, but discrimination, then I think from that place we say, you're not doing anyone a favor by doing affirmative action, you're doing the right thing. And so how do I engage in doing the right thing? And I think that's how I would reframe it and look at it and help assist moving it forward.
All right, thank you. Bishop?
Good afternoon. I'm Bishop Walton, a senior at Andrews Osborne Academy, and today we are enjoying a youth forum panel discussion on affirmative action and unintended consequences featuring Mr. Mike Brickner, Senior Policy Director at ACLU of Ohio, and Dr. Maurice Stinnett, Vice President of University Engagement and Chief Diversity Officer at Cleveland State University, and Dr. Jessica Moore, Professor in the Department of Sociology at Case Western Reserve University. This conversation is moderated by Youth Forum Council President TiOlu Oresanya. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, the City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our webcast. If you have a question, please tweet it at the City Club Youth, and we will try to work it into the program. We want to remind you that our questions should be brief and to the point. Holding the microphones today are Justin Tinker, Youth Forum Vice President and Senior at Hawken High School, and Maria Savani, a senior at Gilmore Academy. May we have the first question, please?
Thank you for the informed discussion. Can you guys briefly discuss the Asian American sentiment towards affirmative action? I know there's been a lot of stuff in the Atlantic and other articles almost talking about the divide between the Asian American community and how maybe admissions rates have not increased at elite colleges versus maybe California state institutions. Thank you.
Before you answer that question, it's also important to know, in line with that question, that a 2009 Department of Justice study showed that Asian Americans need 140 SAT points higher than white Americans to be accepted into elite colleges. They need 320 SAT points higher than Hispanic Americans and 450 higher than Black Americans to be accepted into these elite universities. So if you would like to take on his question.
Well, I'll jump in with one thing is that this is a major issue, right? This is a huge issue because in the Ivy League, they have set caps on how many Asian American students they're going to take. And you're getting an increasing number of applications. So the slots to get in have gotten a lot more competitive. So it becomes harder, and that's a real disservice against Asian Americans who have worked, and that's where the extra points come in, is because it has just gotten so competitive in these high schools. One thing to distinguish in this concern about Asian Americans and their access to higher ed is the difference between foreign-born or second generation and Asian Americans who've been here for multiple generations. And there's a lot of talk now around the idea of very economically disadvantaged Asian American students who are trying to make it and aren't doing it as well as the ones who are more established. So there's actually within the community quite a bit of discrimination.
Yes, so that question sort of led off to what I was going to ask. What can we do when affirmative action might pit one group off the other? Like, sorry, we have enough Hispanics here. We need to find some African Americans, things like that. What can we do?
Yeah, I think that number one, we need to look at the process and the system for admissions. For each school is different. All right, number one, that's the first thing. And I don't want to look at this as pitting one group against the other. We have to reframe the conversation and say, how are we going to make sure that we are inclusive and inviting and accepting all the best students that we can to this institution and making it as diverse and inclusive as possible. And with these caps, I mean, reconsider, again, first of all, taking the caps off. That's one thing that you can just do. And also removing the mindset that there is a particular number in mind that we're trying to reach. It's just we want to get a diverse population that is going to be the best for the institution and the student body population. So reframing how we think about it and reimagining how we go about receiving applicants to the institution.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, it's important to remember that, affirmative action and, race is only one piece of the puzzle in terms of admission, right? And so, I agree of looking at the caps and possibly removing some of those, but I also think that then you have to again, change the conversation of affirmative action and talking about how, creating these inclusive communities benefits all of us, and that, we all have to be in this together to create those communities. And if any one of us are pitted against one another, it's going to be difficult to do that.
Dr. Stinnett, oh, sorry, I didn't mean. You said that you chose prestigious schools to reference, such as Harvard, Princeton, and the correlation between affirmative action and acceptance rate, and you said that it didn't make a big difference. You said that it only changed 1% or between like if you had affirmative action or if you didn't. But how would that change, the correlation change if you were to reference lower tier schools, such as schools that had a higher acceptance rate rather than Harvard, which has a super low acceptance rate?
I understand what you're saying, and I don't want to pretend and give you some information that I did not thoroughly research. I just found this, and I researched that in particular to find that out. But again, across the board, once you add affirmative action to even the lower tier schools, the change rate as far as acceptance is marginal. It is not significant at all. I don't have at the top of my head the exact number as I did for that particular quote, but I'll make sure I will get that for you so that you can have that. That's important because, again, there's a myth out there. It's called dispelling these myths, that if we accept these African American students, that we are, again, not accepting at a larger rate qualified white students, and that's just not true. So I will get you the article and some information that you can have for that to give you the actual numbers across the board. Yeah, good question.
Oh, sorry. My name's Shivani, and I'm a senior at Solon High School, and it's a very competitive, very diverse high school. And so one thing that I've noticed going to this high school, something that's pertaining to this issue, is that a lot of parents, specifically Asian parents, have been so deeply affected by the conversation of affirmative action that they have shifted towards more conservative outlooks in other areas, just specifically because of affirmative action. So they're voting Republican, they're voting conservative, leaning right, really, just because of this issue. So in what ways have you guys noticed that? And is that something that needs to be combated? Do Asian Americans need to be accounted for in order to keep the demographics and the voting base in line?
I think that's a really interesting observation. And before the election, actually, I talked with a couple friends who were Indian American and said the same thing about a lot of their friends and family members, that they had noticed that recently they had gone more towards a conservative bent. I think that that's anecdotal, though. I mean, I think, applying that to the whole group, but I think it gets to this question of kind of pitting one group against another, right? That whenever one group maybe feels like, I'm not being treated fairly, oftentimes and this is the way that white supremacy, continues on in this country, is that they don't get mad at the power structure, the structure that is, perpetuating the system, but they get mad at another group that is being, subjugated under the power structure. And so it's leading then to divisions between groups that should be aligned with one another. And I think that's, again, why we need to change that conversation and ensure that, again, we're all in this together, that we want to change the power structure, not compete for who can get, whatever crumbs are coming down from the power structure.
Dr. Kelley, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I think Asian Americans are in a very difficult position, right? We have something that's called the model minority myth, and it's sort of the idea of here's what a minority group does when you do it right, right? So then they get sort of held up as judgment to other groups of color that have not had similar successes, and in so doing we've set up this pitting in some ways, but that obscures a very, very important fact, which is there's an incredible amount of economic diversity within Asian Americans. It represents 20-some different countries and ethnic groups and languages and histories and relationships with the United States. So in some sense, I would argue to anyone who's sort of leaning in that direction, in the sense that that we need to sort of pay attention to the diversity within group, which have a lot more needs actually than between groups.
I like the way that Mr. Brickner framed that we get distracted, the powers that be get distracted and put the minority parties to pit against each other. It's having a conversation as a community organizer background, is sitting down with the Asian American community, having a conversation, saying, first of all, let's recognize that there is enough room at the table for all of us, number one. No one has to be excluded because we're being inclusive. Number two, with you voting in this particular direction or going this way, is that advantageous for your agenda? Is that aligned with your core values? Is that assisting you? It's having that conversation, removing the fear, removing the myths, and having an honest conversation with other minority groups to say, we're in this together and we can succeed together, and we all have access to this table. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this great forum. So my question is, in the information brochure, it says it basically supports white women, but how does it support white women? Could you elaborate a little bit, and why white women oppose it? And another thing is, it's a complex issue, and it seems to me it's a complex formula. like you have to not only consider races, but also gender and also background and economic, background. So what kind of formula is it exactly? I mean, it seems very not concrete. It's pretty like foggy to me. Could you please explain a little more? Thank you.
Well, sure. So first of all, with the formula, it is foggy and very complex, and in fact, it is different based off of the institution. So different schools have different formulas. But as we've said before, race or sex, they're only one part of whatever formula. There's no university or college that I know of in the United States that makes admissions decisions solely based off of race or solely based off of gender. So it's one small part, along with, did you attend a rural school or an urban school, or what was your GPA, or what types of extracurricular programs were you involved in, and all of those different types of questions. So it is one piece of it. I think that, for white women in particular, why they have benefited so much is, I think, some of what was discussed previously on the panel, that, of course, sex has been used as part of affirmative action, and so certainly women were advanced through affirmative action, both with employment and educational opportunities. But that I think that, again, it speaks to the complexities of I think, race in this country, that it was, I think, a lot safer for people to advance the interests of white women, and that a lot of the social safety nets, as Dr. Stinnett said earlier, are better in place for white women as a whole across this country than for people of color. And so that's why we're seeing, I think, the discrepancy there.
Hi, my name is Louisana Gonzalez, and I am from Solon High School too. And I guess my question was that in terms of the Asian American community and like how affirmative action impacts them, like we're speaking a lot about like changing the conversation and like not pitting these groups against each other, but like changing the conversation doesn't innately solve these problems for the Asian American community. I mean, you can change the conversation with them and you can say like, this is why we believe that affirmative action has to continue. This is why we justify it. But like, how do you at the end of the day, like, I don't know, solve the injustices that it sort of puts on the Asian American community? And also like, sorry, this is extended, but like, also like, when we talk about like how it's only one small component, how race is only one small component in like a student's application, that's true, but like, didn't the study that she referenced about SAT points, wouldn't that already controlled for those variables? We're still seeing like SAT points like that have to be immensely much higher for these students, and those variables such as backgrounds or rural schools or GPAs, aren't they already controlled for?
I think what you just said on the back end answers the conversation I'm talking about having and reframing it is not just within the Asian American community. That's just one part of it. The institutions have to have an internal conversation. As the Chief Diversity Officer, again, it's my job to have this institutional conversation to say, what are our practices, what are our policies that we have in place as far as admissions that is limiting the amount of Asian Americans or Asian students that can come into this institution? And why is that? And how are we revisiting that? What is the conversation around that? Even looking at the test scores, what are we doing? How are we assessing that? What does the application process look like? It's an internal conversation that I'm talking about in two forms, with the community itself, but then also the institution. We have to reassess how we're admitting these students and the criteria that we're putting in place and the potential or possible barriers that we are creating for these students. That's where the critical conversation, because you're talking about the structural institutional change. And and I hear you. We can't just ask the Asian Americans to have a conversation, reimagine their position and how affirmative action is impacting them without the institution at the very same time having that conversation and being courageous enough to make some drastic steps and take some action in changing that. And so that's what I'm saying, this and that, doing that at the same time.
I think you really can't. sort of underestimate the power of socioeconomic status, right? That students coming from families who are middle class, upper middle class, and they're going to do just fine. They're going to get through life just fine in some ways because, because their parents have put them in college prep courses, and they're going to do these things. They're going to get into a college somewhere, and they're going to do these sorts of things. But, when you've come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, where maybe your parents don't even understand, have never been to college and don't even understand what an application process looks like, then you end up, we end up with sort of a lot of really sort of class stratification in our higher education. And unfortunately, in the United States, that maps onto race and ethnicity in certain ways, which makes it a complicated conversation to have as well. But I was emphasizing about the Asian community. I mean, we have, if you are second generation or even first generation and you've come here, you may not have the resources or the capital, the human capital to get to college, and that person is just as disadvantaged as the one who's on the upper end who has to overachieve in order to make a place. So that's why it gets complex.
Marina Vladova, I teach at Andrews Osborne Academy. I'm just wondering, I've heard you refer to Asian Americans and Asians, and I'm wondering if these caps apply to people from an ethnicity or a country of origins. And I don't know, it sort of suggests to me in a more insidious way that Asian Americans are still looked at as the other in this country.
Well, so I think again with I don't have as much experience in terms of working at higher institutions as the other two panelists, so they may have other experiences. But in terms of how how Asian Americans are sometimes broken down in terms of a demographic, like I know from my own personal experience. So when I went to college, I was on a committee that was tasked with hiring more faculty of color at my school, and we were specifically tasked with hiring people from traditionally underrepresented categories. And so when we looked at that, it wasn't just any person of color, but when we looked at Asian Americans, for instance, we looked specifically for people who were Pacific Islanders. That was a group that was traditionally underrepresented, whereas people from Eastern Asia were actually already represented at our school. And so I think it may depend on school by school who the categories are. And I think it speaks to what Dr. Kelley said earlier, which is that Asian Americans writ large are an extremely diverse and varied population, and so it's hard to just categorize them under one category.
Dr. Kelley, do you want to answer this?
Well, I think I just want to sort of go back to just one slight point, which is just the fact that when we started out with affirmative action, right? The idea was we were trying to repair a system we had made, which doubly and triply disadvantaged persons of color. And then we sort of started with the Equal Employment Opportunity Acts. We sort of have expanded the number of groups of people that we're sort of thinking about, and in some ways that's diluted the conversation around historically structural disadvantage for certain groups, because now it includes disability status, includes age, it includes religion, and all these things. And they have, in each of these categories, have different and complicated relationships with social structure and policy and being included and excluded. So, and that actually I think makes it almost makes it sort of seem intractable to talk about affirmative action, because we say, well, that's fine, but what about this group? And what about this group? And what this sort of thing? And it takes our eye off the ball, which is really about, who have we historically discriminated against and why.
Hi, my name is Alice Wu, and I'm a senior at Solon High School. So my question was, do you believe that if affirmative action was geared not necessarily more towards helping students of color, but helping students that were more economically disadvantaged, would it be more effective and would it be less controversial?
I think that has happened in Texas. I believe they have a system where they are just admitting the top 10% of the schools across the board, okay? What that does, though, is it leaves out a large group of people when you just do it that way. When you don't take into account race, it doesn't level the playing field as much as we would think. It's a very complicated issue. It's a noble effort to do that because they call that colorblind admissions that they're attempting to do. But again, it only captures a small percentage of the African American people of color to those admissions. So you still have to have some emphasis on that, in my opinion, in order to adequately capture the audience and get the admissions that we're looking for as far as diversity within those classes. So yes, it's being done, but it's being looked at. Again, the Texas model is where it's happening right now.
I think to add on to what Dr. Kelley just previously said too is that, you know, I believe race is special in this country, that it needs to be looked at uniquely and differently than other things. I think that that economic class is also an important indicator. But I think that, as Dr. Stinnett said, if we were just to look at class, we would miss a lot of the important discussion and the changes that we need to make in terms of race. I would actually say, rather than saying, should we look at race or class, maybe a better system would be one that is race and class and specifically focuses on low-income people of color and people of color who are most disadvantaged in the system.
So a very underrepresented group in America, as we know, are Native Americans in terms of education. So how does affirmative action affect Natives, and how can we improve the education of the Native population through affirmative action, seeing as only 1% of total enrollment in universities are Natives?
It needs to be an intentional effort on the university's part. I mean, we need to raise the profile, have the conversation intentionally about Native Americans, and put systems in place to attract, recruit, and retain them. I think that's just an honest conversation. And unfortunately, Native Americans typically get lost in the conversation of diversity, inclusion, et cetera, underrepresented communities. And that's something that I'm actually working with now at Cleveland State, talking about what are we doing to specifically target this group, to make sure that we have program systems in place and going out to those communities saying, what are your needs? What's happening in your community? How can we best assist you? Because clearly affirmative action is not working in the same regards with that particular community as it is with others. And so I think we need to be intentional, have the conversation, and then put some action behind the conversation. Yes,
I think that's actually a really great example of how race and class mix in this conversation, and it shows the, frankly, failed promises that we have made to Native American people for, centuries now, that we have, largely put those communities out on reservations with very little resources, given them very few resources to have adequate educational systems, have really extremely disadvantaged them. And so it's beyond just sending out more recruiters to try and get those individuals to apply to college, but this really gets to obliterating the systemic racism that has oppressed Native American communities for centuries upon centuries. And so that's really, to me, for that community particularly, the issue that we need to get to there.
Greetings. I want to thank you for creating this opportunity for this dialogue. I think it's awesome for this group, and I thank you all for your input. We've said a couple things about the formula. The formula is actually very simple. If you collect federal dollars, you have to, from everyone, you have to spend federal dollars on everyone. And I think affirmative action is asking institutions like you all to make the extra effort to make sure that the dollars are spent on everyone. Having said that, I wanted to know if you can recommend any books or workshops or experiences like this that our children can be plugged into, where they can dialogue and kick this issue around some more. I want to recommend Dr. King's Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos to Community. And I do know that the King Nonviolent Center offers a camp in each summer where you can go and discuss some of these issues. And if you have any other resources like that, I'd love to hear them.
Cleveland State, let me put a plug here for Cleveland. We have a department that falls under my division, community engagement, civic engagement, and also the Institution of Multicultural Equity and Inclusion. And so we have these focus forums all of the time that are addressing these issues and having these conversations. And I would encourage you to look to our website, number one, because we're always having these ongoing discussions, conferences, and conversations for the community at large. And so check out the website, and I'm going to go to the Division of University Engagement and the Office of Inclusion and Equity, and we have these resources made available. And in particular, we're bringing in, again, we're going to have panel discussions at the university for the community. We have some internal people who's going to sit on that. So go to Cleveland State, look at the website, and we have plenty of material there that we have ongoing work around these issues. Yes.
Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't plug Case Western Reserve's, Social Justice Institute, and they have really made a mark in the community and really have a significant number of critical race discussions across a lot of different kinds of domains, and they have community fora, and you actually just go to the Social Justice Institute website, and they're open to the public, and they're free, and they have these kinds of conversations all the time. That said, two other resources you can have on your own. I highly recommend Ira Katznelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White, and it takes the 20th century apart and talks about all the ways we built everything from Social Security to the GI Bill to be explicitly racist in how people got benefits and what that's done in the future. And just this weekend, I saw a wonderful documentary called Tell Them We Are Rising, and it's on a history of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, and about their role in creating a higher education space in a system that didn't want it. And so I really recommend that. It was very educational.
I'll give a plug for my organization as well. So the ACLU of Ohio hosts public forums pretty frequently. Just last week we had one featuring people who were returning citizens and had collateral consequences, and were trying to get employment, educational, and housing resources, but facing a lot of barriers. And of course that disproportionately impacts people of color in our community. You can go to our website. It's ACLUohio.org. You can sign up for our email list. But there's frequent programs in our Cleveland office in Midtown, just down the street from Cleveland State University, and the other side of the street from Case Western. And you can also sign up for our email alerts so that when there's legislation or other types of policies that are making its way through our state legislature, through our federal legislature, we'll alert you to those. Because again, the discussion around affirmative action is important, but we also have to look at all of the other systems, I think, that are holding people of color back in our communities, and fight against those.
Well, thank you to our panelists. A round of applause for our panelists, if you will. And I'll also plug our organization, the Youth Forum Council. If you'd like to join, we are still taking applications online at cityclub.org. We were in charge of putting on this entire program, and a special thank you to the City Club for making this possible for all of us. Madeline?
Hello. Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Youth Forum panel discussion about affirmative action and the unintended consequences. The Youth Forum series is sponsored by AT&T. We are grateful for their continued support of our programming. Additionally, we welcome students from Andrews Osborne Academy, Cleveland School of Architecture and Design, Gilmore Academy, Max S. Hayes High School, Shaw High School, Solon High School, St. Martin de Porres, and Washington Park Environment Science Academy. We thank all of you for being here today. If you enjoyed today's forum, join us Thursday, November 2nd at noon for the second Youth Forum of the 2017-2018 school year. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you to Mr. Brickner, Dr. Stinnett, and Professor Kelley, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.